In the most extreme situation, for example, if you don't diagnose that someone's having a heart attack, they're probably not going to survive that episode.
Are you or a loved one the victim of a medical misdiagnosis, and what can you do about it? Well, that's what we're going to ask the lawyer today. Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Rosenthal with AskTheLawyers.com, and my guest is attorney Lyle Warshauer with the Warshauer Law Group in Atlanta. Lyle, thank you for making some time to answer our questions today.
Good to be with you.
So we're talking about a medical misdiagnosis. People probably think they know what a misdiagnosis is, but let's talk about from the law standpoint. What exactly are we talking about?
So it is sort of easy to understand in one respect. It's an observational error, if you will. So there are a variety of ways that there can be a misdiagnosis in medicine. There's sort of four categories. But basically, it can start with just a medical provider not recognizing that a patient's signs and symptoms, however they present to the doctor or nurse, represent an illness or an injury, and they just don't observe that properly. But more likely, it's something where you have to go further. So there's a sign or symptom that would need a further test or study to be done to determine if the illness or injury is one thing or another. So doctors have to look at all of these situations, and they have to come up with a variety of diagnoses, and they have to rule in or rule out what is right or what is wrong. So there could be a situation where the wrong test is done, or ultimately the test or study could be misinterpreted itself. So a really obvious one would be an X-ray is misread, or a blood test is misinterpreted. Another category of misdiagnosis is where you have a screening exam that would be done. So there's no sign or symptom in the patient, but the guidelines suggest that certain tests or studies should be done at various intervals in a person's life, and the provider just doesn't recommend that or make the order. So it might be, a colonoscopy after a certain age. Both men and women would get a colonoscopy. Women require mammograms starting at a certain age, depending on certain risk factors for that individual. Gentlemen need a PSA test for prostate cancer at a certain age or based on certain risk factors, or it could be at the very beginning of life with a newborn that needs to have a metabolic screening exam done. And if that is not ordered or not conducted properly, that could be a misdiagnosis. There's a saying in medicine that when you hear hoofbeats, it's probably a horse and not a zebra. So we consider that, those of us who do these kinds of cases, and we think, is it obvious? Did they go with the more exotic diagnosis where the more obvious one was there?
Is this misdiagnosis oftentimes, usually, most of the time, Lyle, is it because of negligence? Is it because of, well, maybe the person doesn't have insurance coverage to order all these tests? What are some of the reasons for this?
It could be both, obviously. So the negligence is the failure to do what a reasonable provider would do in the same or similar circumstances. So in order to determine if there's negligence, you really do have to look at all of the circumstances. What did the medical provider, the doctor or the nurse or the physician's assistant, whoever is involved in caring for the patient, what did they know and what could they know? So if it's a situation where just asking enough questions would reveal what they need to know to make the proper diagnosis, those questions should be asked. But if it's a situation where a test is necessary, something, let's say you need to do a complex biopsy or something, and that is necessary to make the diagnosis, but the patient is not able to, for whatever reason, either they refuse it or they can't afford it, then the doctor would be limited in the information that he or she has available. So it's really looking at the whole circumstances. More often than not, it's not something where you can just look at a black and white situation. It's usually a situation where you're looking at what one doctor knows or what, for example, a doctor may be appropriate in ordering a test. Let's say the doctor orders a CT to determine if there is a pulmonary embolism in the lung, to see if the patient has that is the reason for their shortness of breath. The test is appropriately ordered, but if the radiologist doesn't review it properly and says there's no clot in that lung, but there is, the first doctor does the right thing, but the diagnosis is still wrong because another provider did not give the proper information. So it's a big picture. You have to look at all of the details.
A lot of human error can be involved there. What about equipment? If there's equipment that's not calibrated correctly or malfunctions or something like that, does that happen?
That does happen. And I think that would certainly be a defense, if you will, but more often than not, it's not a failure in the equipment. It's a failure in the operation of the equipment. Because even if the equipment does fail, that's something in and of itself that medical providers know to be looking for. And if they proceeded with a test without those indicators that it is working properly, then that in and of itself might be the basis for a claim.
If somebody comes in, just, a regular visit and the doctor has plenty of time to make a diagnosis, that would seem to me to be a different situation than, say, in an emergency room where things happen very quickly. Does that alter liability at all, an emergency room setting?
Absolutely. So again, we look at what is reasonable under the circumstances. And so some of the most common misdiagnoses that we see happen in an emergency setting. For example, a heart attack or a stroke. Patients often present to an emergency department or emergency facility with complaints that would lead them to be diagnosed with one of those things. So that does often happen in the emergency department. And because those situations usually involve a situation where there's not a pre-existing doctor-patient relationship, where the doctor would have some knowledge of the patient's history, for example, what kind of medications they've taken, what kind of other circumstances, illnesses they've had. It's more fraught, if you will, and more likely to lead to misdiagnosis, but it can happen just as often with an established relationship.
And I would imagine sometimes, Lyle, misdiagnosis can be caught and there's no harm done, but sometimes I could also, on the other hand, imagine there can be great harm done by a misdiagnosis.
Absolutely. I mean, in the most extreme situation, for example, if you don't diagnose that someone's having a heart attack, they're probably not going to survive that episode. But it also can be a situation where what is going on with the patient on that day does not appear to be very critical, but the failure to diagnose the condition then allows it to grow. For example, the failure to diagnose a cancer, an early stage cancer can be treated, a later stage cancer cannot. So it might be something that is acute or urgent at that moment, but the damage can occur down the road.
The results of these kind of things can, like we say, can be very tragic. People can be going through a very terrible time in their life. What if they're thinking, on top of this, I can't afford an attorney to take my case, Lyle? What is your answer to that?
Well, when we handle cases for malpractice cases and personal injury cases of this nature, we handle them on a contingency fee basis. So there isn't any cost to the client or the potential client as we investigate the case and then proceed forward with the case. So we only are paid if we are successful in getting compensation for our client. So it is not something that needs to add to the burden of the individual who's suffering or the family investigating, because we handle that.
It's great information, Lyle. Thank you so much for helping us and answer our questions today.
My pleasure.
That's going to do it for this episode of Ask the Lawyer. My guest has been attorney Lyle Warshauer of Atlanta, Georgia. If you want the best information or you're ready to choose a lawyer that lawyers choose, make sure to go to AskTheLawyers.com. And also please take a second to like, share, and subscribe by clicking below. Thanks for watching. I'm Rob Rosenthal with AskTheLawyers.com.